So the title of my talk is called Misplaced Commas and Cannibalistic Tendencies. Firstly, I'd like to thank Ansam Frank and Hunjin Kim and David Tay and the HKW staff for their hospitality and support in inviting me here this weekend. I very much enjoyed yesterday's discussions, especially being able to hear about Zomia firsthand. Scott's theorizing of Zomia provides a model for a way of understanding or thinking about outsiders, peripheries and margins, of decentering the nation or the state as primary societal structures. What would it mean to understand the Highlanders of this region, not as outcasts left behind by modernity, but more like runaways, autonomous and evasive? How might using the fugitive or the rogue as key terms in my practice, instead of the minor and the marginal, help me articulate my thoughts? What's of interest to me is the way that agency and intent are brought in as important factors in the way that we can think about non-incorporated positions. These positions of active indeterminacy or strategies of evasion based not only on flight but also of contingent practices. Of course, I may be misusing Scott's thesis, but whether metaphorical or descriptive, a model necessarily becomes interpretive. And as an artist within my practice, I can be accused of flirting promiscuously with a range of ideas that might provoke new positions, approaches, critical responses, often appropriating and cannibalizing both content and form. Yesterday night, we also ended the evening with Nontawat's very moving work on the Shan State Army, where in his film No Boy's Land, a whole community of people are somehow stuck in limbo, full of intent, but very much lacking agency. This too came across in the film that Amsam showed of Seren and Sonam called Middle Way or Independence. Non-incorporation here on the ground is difficult to live with. The focus of the presentation will revolve around two connected projects. Come Cannibalize Us, Why Don't You? Silamango Kanikalban Kami Mautak, and Apa Jika, the Misplaced Comma. Both take the collecting and display practices of colonial and post-colonial museums and explore areas of repatriation or re-entry for the fugitive or rogue object. Both Come Cannibalize Us and Apa Jika explore the tropes and traps involved in representation and the transnational entanglements that moving objects and people present. The geographical or transnational coordinates of these projects centers around Singapore, Britain, and what once was called Malaya. Come Cannibalize Us, Why Don't You? Was an artist's response that revisited through reuse, reenactment, and repatriation the artifacts and writings from an earlier exhibition shown at the NUS Museum in Singapore, entitled Camping and Tramping Through the Colonial Archive, the Museum in Malaya. This exhibition charted the development of colonial museums in Malaya, which took place alongside the development of colonial administration and control in the region. Artifacts from the exhibition were reused and recombined with new materials forming new assemblages. I was particularly interested in the process of colonial collecting and display, both the ideology underpinning it and the resultant dislocation and transfer of hundreds and thousands of artifacts and specimens, both live and cured, from Malaya and the region to Britain, Europe, and America, to zoos, museums, and collections of the wealthy. One major focus that developed in the work was our ideas around repatriation. I'm using repatriation here quite loosely, and it covers both the association of repatriation claims in relation to looted artifacts with some idea of the ill-gotten, stolen, or wrongfully acquired, but it also covers less sinister ideas of return, often charged with some idea of a rightful home to go to. In particular, I was interested in the idea of repatriating the object with no shadow. I wanted to think about the types of objects that perhaps do not take physical form, or do not take shape fully, or cannot be seen and grappled with, because they are not illuminated, and thus are hidden or lack definition. I was thinking about the thousands of objects held within various institutional collections in Britain, but that are never activated, observed, or made to perform. I was also thinking about digital objects and the way in which physical artifacts become digital artifacts as a route to them being so-called returned home. I will show a couple of clips from the work Repatriating the Object with No Shadow, Along, Against, Within and Through, which was part of Come Cannibalize Us, and acted as a form of captioning for the installed assemblages. It's a work which takes an encyclopedic structure and picks up on various ideas and storylines that came up during my research. One of the ideas tackled an assumption I had had, that most objects, artifacts, specimens, or people move from colonial outposts to the metropole, and repatriation here would mean a return to a post-independent nation. But I also wanted to include the possibility of a repatriation that went the other way. The shadowless object in this case could be an idea or a set of ideas that had become internalized and as such hidden or lacking definition. What would it take perhaps to repatriate the ideology of the Enlightenment or Encyclopedic Museum from a post-colonial location? How is decolonization possible? I was looking for bodies of knowledge, forgotten bodies, and the kind of bodies that might make you think differently. A small paragraph in the Raffles Museum annual report describes the museum's most popular and curious object, the cast of a Malay man. One of Raffles Museum's most popular artifacts was a life-size model of a Malay man dressed in traditional clothes, or baju kurung, complete with sarong and kris. The museum staff had volunteered to have his body cast in plaster for this purpose. The lifelike model led some visitors to believe it had been made using the same method as skinning and stuffing the creatures found in the animal gallery of the museum. He was willing. Do you know the process of casting the human body? Incarcerated and slowly fixing plaster. The process of going off is a chemical reaction. The heat slowly swells, and from worrying not to move, you realize you no longer can move. Fixed, held in place. I think about recasting a Malay body, recasting physically and metaphorically. We do not know the name of the Malay man who lent his body for the cast, but we do know his designation. Working in the museum as a jaga, or janitor, or caretaker. The museum is a hierarchical place. Directors are like gods, who give or not give permission to access this cultural resource, our heritage, the intellectual capital of our nations, or in the colonial museum, the temporarily appropriated nations of others. Or for some museums, the more permanently held intellectual property of other nations. Their director is a man who wears socks, the jaga, warden and vigilator or caretaker, the one who doesn't. Returning to our cast Malay body, this object was never accessioned, which means although it may have been part of the display within the museum, it was never a part of its collections. So too the support structures, the plinths, the vitrines, the things that both protect and hold up and fix the objects in time and place. They are dispensable. The Malay man was only a cast, a mannequin with local features, something to demonstrate the wearing of songket and sarong. I think about Ahmad, the director of the museum, and think about casting his body. I imagine the process of applying Vaseline to all his body parts. I imagine the conversation during the time it would take to complete this, and I imagine the care and control I would need and to have over this body during this period of incarceration. I do not ask him to undress for me. There is no subservient Malay body here this time. I'll show another clip now. It was in 1914. I was on a collecting expedition with the director of the museum 100 miles up the river. We had planned to trek further into the interior, when the war cries of the tribespeople spread through the jungle, and they were on the path thirsting for heads. Our 100 porters left us, and there we were, a small body of 17 collectors.
The colonial archive is littered with the we-set-off-at-daybreak accounts. The history of collecting cannot be seen without some recourse to the discourse of adventure and exploration. It would seem that they go hand in hand. So too the accounts of illness. Many an ill-fated expedition ended up aborted, with fever-racked bodies being sent back to milder climates. The accounts seem to heave with unspoken dangers, of illness, poisoned darts, unfaithful porters. But equally the numbers accumulated of dead, stuffed, embalmed, dried, cooked, deboned animal carcasses, crated and ferried across and through the jungle, rivers, seas, to museums, zoos and private collections, seem enough to prove that some sort of advantage was had. An advantage in the technologies of dislocation.
The technologies of dislocation referred to here encompass the process by which objects were forcibly extracted from original locations and then put through a series of physical and metaphysical transitions or journeys, a methodology of dislocation which both cinema and museums do so well. The green screen process of transportation within cinema works both on the object or performer and on the viewer. So too the creation of museum dioramas, or indeed the kind of specialist lighting museums often seek to use, which create a sort of spatial void where the object is left floating in mid-air, out of context and shadowless. What happens when one takes the background of something away? How long can it remain unhinged and stateless? What gets put in its place? The final clip I'll show has two parallel storylines. One, the story of Omar, the local informant of Ivor Evans, who was an anthropologist and curator at Taiping Museum in the early 1900s. Taiping was one of the first museums in Malaya and was part of the colonial development of Taiping, along with a clock tower, train station and local jail. The second storyline is the documentation of the exhumation of the remains from Singapore of the exiled historical figure Na Ibrahim, who in the colonial accounts was seen as party to the assassination of a key British government figure in the late 1800s. He was exiled from Malaysia and never returned. In 2006, his remains and tomb were apparently found in Singapore, and given the post-independent reversal of history, Na Ibrahim was returned in a Malaysian Navy vessel and given a hero's reinstatement.
Omar was a true Malay, and as I was more in contact with him than with any other person for a whole year, I will describe him as well as I am able. At the time, I may say, I lived entirely among the Malays, seldom seeing Europeans. My conversation was in Malay, and current events were discussed in that language. Omar might stand about 5 feet 4 inches. He dressed in the usual manner of Malays, a plaid sarong, salo trousers, and baju coat. On his head he wore a Bugis handkerchief, and on his feet he wore sandals. By his side was a kriss, which he never parted for a moment. At a distance he might have been taken for a Scottish Highlander. When near, his copper-coloured skin, black twinkling eyes, Mongolian physiognomy proved that he was a Malay. He was independent in his tone, but respectful in his manners, and during my long intercourse with him he neither betrayed a tincture of low breeding, nor a sign of loose and improper thoughts. Indeed, his sense was delicate and keen. His ideas had a tone of high standard. He was mindful of money for any other object that was necessary to maintain himself and family. He gradually commanded my friendship. I felt I could not but respect him. His conversation was intelligent on the affairs of the surrounding state. His information was deep in the characteristics of his own race, and his description of past and passing events interesting and instructive. Yet he could neither read nor write, a defect he bewailed with much sorrow. When Omar was a young man, he was a wild young man, and wanted to see the world. And so in a moment of unguardedness, he was caught in the meshes of an enlisting sergeant of the Ceylon Rifle Corps. Dosed with narcotics, and before seeing either father or mother, he was carried on board a ship bound for a long foreign service. Omar was borne off, and he landed safely in Ceylon, was drilled and stiffened into the shape of a British soldier. He was also sent to school, but could never learn the difference between A and B. He, however, progressed so far in English as to speak it parrot-like, but what he said was better understood by himself. He served for 27 years, after which he yearned to return to his native land. He got his discharge without pension. The reason of this I could never satisfactorily learn. So he returned penniless to Pulau Penang to find father and mother, sisters and brothers, all gone. The very posts of his father's house had rotted away.
The research from Cannibalize Us led to the development of a series of works titled The Forgotten Weaver, which focuses on the figure of a Malayan weaver who lived and demonstrated her craft in the Malayan Pavilion at the British Empire exhibition in 1924 in London. Apa Jika, the Misplaced comma, is one of the works in this series. It was commissioned for the inaugural launch of Singapore's National Gallery and is currently exhibited in the Diaspora Pavilion in Venice. A minor figure in the exhibition histories of Malaya, Halima exists as a series of footnotes, gaining historical attention only for the act of a premature or untimely death from pneumonia in London and away from home. These notes you can see here come from a several hundred-page report on the Malayan Pavilion, where a list of the other 19 Malayan participants can be found, and details about their living conditions. Although not a human zoo, the Malayans were housed inside the pavilion, but at the back of the exhibition in an ex-army hut. You can see a group photograph of the Malayan contingent and the various colonial organisers of the pavilion. Halima's body was not returned home, but given a Muslim burial in a cemetery just outside of London. Here her remains are located in an unmarked grave. Although I had the allotment deed numbers for her grave, the numerical numbering system used in 1924 has since changed, and it's now impossible to find which of the unmarked graves might be hers. As for her work, the product of her labour may potentially be amongst the collections held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, after having initially been gifted to the Queen. An incomplete textile on an incomplete loom is also part of the V&A's collections, and may hold a record of her last creative act. I say may because opportunities to record at the time the names of the producers of these textiles were not taken. And photographs such as this, which is of the weaving section of the Malayan Pavilion, does not individually name the subjects in the image. And as we saw previously in the group photograph, the Malay contingent were not named, the women in the group being captioned only as Malay Lady. Apa Jika, the Misplaced comma, explores Halima's status as both object and subject and the possible forms of repatriation that might occur in the reuse and revisiting of a minor historical figure through the appropriating acts of an artist today. As a weaver, her participation or mode of operation in the Empire exhibition was arguably twofold. She was both the textile producer and also producer of the image of the Malay woman and female Malay handicraft labour at work, a labour or industry that at the time of exhibition was undergoing rapid decline due to the competition posed by the industrialisation of the cotton mills in England. Halima here seemed the ultimate example of a shadowless object, in that other than her being selected to participate in the exhibition and being considered an expert weaver, there is little on record that marks her out as anything other than a very unremarkable marginal figure. Her death, however, does single her out, and it's this fact that makes her of interest to me. This unfortunate end to her life whilst performing her role as the subjugated colonial Malay woman, the lack of a return in her story, and her unmarked resting place provide interesting similarities to the traditional recuperated hero. However, unlike that figure, Halima's story has little contour. She is a figure that for the mainstay has been written out of history, forgotten and unexamined. In this way she could be seen as a fugitive, but here not so much the first meaning of the term, one who has escaped or one that flees, but the secondary meaning of something ill-defined. My question then became how might this be deturned, rewritten, to produce Halima differently? How could we throw light onto her story so as to illuminate not her per se, but the structural processes by which she is marginalised, not just once but twice? Here Halima needs to be less fugitive and more rogue. Repatriation seems to imply that there is a rightful place to return to. In the case of Halima, My original research transcripts had misplaced a comma and wrongly noted Halima as coming from Singapore. As the project developed and became commissioned by the National Gallery in Singapore, I returned to these notes and with horror found my mistake. Halima was not from Singapore, but actually from across the causeway or border. That is, she was from Johor in Malaysia. The process of return that I was using was in fact not a return, but instead more of an appropriation. Apa Jika, the misplaced comma, becomes an attempt to insert, if we understand Singapore and Malaysia as two independent nations, or reinsert, if we acknowledge historical connections, Halima into the developing discourses of modernity and Singaporean art canonization that the National Gallery Singapore is becoming symbolic of. To this day, in the Singapore art history galleries, there is no work present of Malay female artists. The Malay female body, as image, is, however, quite abundant, filling multiple wall spaces with her objecthood, and providing the predominantly male Chinese painters central to the Singapore art canon with their subject. It is in the misplacing of Halima, or the comma, that I hope the work produces a reflexive awareness of the criteria in use within the development of current national canonical discourses. Apa Jika, in the title of the work, in Malay means what if. This and the idea of misplacing or an out of placing points to a desire for reconfiguring the interpretive works which fix what should be seen as inherently unstable and in contention. Whilst throwing light at Halima doesn't bring us any closer to her, arguably producing a haunted spectre as opposed to a repatriated cultural icon, but the process of doing so does cast shadow on the curatorial frameworks and collective national imaginings in operation in Singapore post-independence. And I'll just finish the talk with the final video in the three-part series of Apa Jika.
Colleagues, I want to suggest that we reinstate her disempowered voice into our discussion on artistic practice, because I think there's a common desire to challenge narratives we find hegemonic, to challenge discourses we find overpowering, and to destabilize art canons that we find excessively formal. And I think our project, comes from that same wider place, particularly in the case when the subject under review is of a minority group, be it sexual orientation, religious affiliation, ethnicity, or gender. So I think what we're trying to do here is sound in basic principles. But at the same time, we have to be very careful. What we want to do is to reclaim and restore a voice that has been subjected, a voice that is subaltern, and that has been subjected to the metropole's hegemonic discourse. But at the same time, even though our intentions are good, we have to be very mindful of the fact that reclamation is always an intensely political project, and that we cannot anachronistically impose our own value systems onto someone we cannot claim to have known very well. Due to a lack of archival material, we have bare scraps of information. I don't even think we have a footnote, we have a